Thanks, Jono. Good evening, everyone. So through Sunday nights this year, we've been working our way through stories in the Bible. Last week, Brad did a story called The Transfiguration. And this week, we come to Matthew chapter 18, around the topic of Jesus teaches forgiveness. So certainly anchored in that particular chapter, but it is not the only occasion where Jesus talks about forgiveness. So before I begin tonight, I really just want to do a little bit of a scene set. I'm not going to do anything, I hope, super complicated this evening, which is I'm not going to hand out some workbook for you to work your way through forgiveness in your own life, or tell you what you need to do for your situation in terms of 5 steps to a better you or anything like that. I hope the tone of tonight is less of a lecture and more of a conversation with you. And as we work our way through Matthew chapter 18, let's see if we can sort of sit alongside the disciples in this chapter and hear what Christ was trying to teach them. There's a lot of opinions around certain aspects of this particular chapter. And I think as a result, there becomes lots of misunderstanding about what Jesus taught. But it's super important, this idea of forgiveness, because there's a lot of hurt out there. And there's one big idea that I want to rest around tonight, which is the idea about forgiveness, that it might be something that you do for another person. It may not be something that you do for another person. It might be something that you do for yourself. Some of you here tonight might have felt pressure to forgive before you've even had the chance to heal. And in a religious context, you might even be told that if you're experiencing pain, it means you haven't forgiven, and that's almost like a failure of faith. And so that's what I want to, again, repeat tonight, which is I'm not going to demand anything of you around that. Wherever you're at, whatever you're carrying, there's no pressure through tonight to sort anything out. We're just going to sit with Jesus' message in this Gospel of Matthew. Before we get into what Jesus taught, we can reflect on who Jesus is as a person. Because it matters. He's not just a teacher. He is someone that's felt what we each have been carrying. The writer of Hebrews puts it this way in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, talking about Jesus. He says that he was a man who, he wasn't a person who can't be touched with the feeling of infirmities, as in he can be. Because he was at all points tempted like we are, yet without sin. So he was born into this world, a world which we experience, a world which is full of hurt because of how we as humans choose to carry on with each other. That means that Jesus was tempted. He suffered. If you're familiar with the gospel writings, you'll know how true that is. You'll know that he was let down by people that he loved. He knows these feelings. And so what does he do with that knowledge in terms of describing this in his ministry? There's a thread that goes through Matthew which shows that Christ isn't some distant lawgiver. It's exactly this message from Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. There's a movement that Jesus makes towards people that approach him time and time again. He wants to lift up or lift off what people are carrying in terms of burdens in their lives. I'm going to suggest to you for the purpose of tonight that one of the heaviest things that a human can carry is an unresolved wound. The weight of what someone did to you, because it becomes part of your story, and it's a story that you keep retelling. It's like a debt that you are still owing. And I use the word debt. Yes, it's a Bible word, but what do we mean by that? Well, if somebody wronged you, you might say, they owe me. And it creates that idea of a financial transaction, a debt. And it's a burden, and Jesus knows it. So before he gets to Matthew 18, there's this consistent pattern of teaching that Jesus does around his approach to discipleship and what he calls people to leave behind in terms of the things of this world and think about what it means to be a disciple of Christ. When he gave his first major teaching speech, which happens in Matthew chapter 5, it's called the Sermon on the Mount. What Jesus does is he inverts, or he really challenges the way that we naturally come at lots of different things. In Matthew chapter 5, in verse 1, it says, he sees these multitudes and he goes up into a mountain. When he was set, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and he taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And there's one of those inversions or a paradigm shift straight out, which is you would expect people to be part of Christ's kingdom to say, you are going to be loaded with wealth or something like that. But he says to this, makes an appeal or observes for the people that are poor in spirit, they've got this future promise of a kingdom of heaven, a future reward. Or he recognises in verse 4, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. So he expects that there'll be a future time where things will be resolved. And how did this go on? Well, this whole sermon goes across 3 chapters. Part of the sermon is he has to explain how to pray as part of it, and that's in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 9. They're asking them, how do you pray? And Jesus' answer in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 9 says, After this manner therefore pray ye, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be your name. And down in verse 12 then it says, Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And there's that word debts there and forgiveness being associated together. It's that idea that I presented earlier, which is if somebody has wronged you, you say, well, they owe me something. And so here the appeal is I'm releasing that debt. I'm forgiving that debt in the same way as we're looking for God to forgive us for what we do. Debts are like shortcomings, people that have missed the mark. In Matthew chapter 9, there's a story about Jesus talking to a man who is paralysed. That's in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 2. And it says there, a group of friends are bringing this man who's paralysed. It says in the King James Version, which I'm reading from, they brought a man sick of the palsy, lying on a bed, and Jesus, seeing their faith of these friends, said unto the sick of the palsy, or the paralysed, Son, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee. And he was healed, and he's using the word sins, and he's healed him. And there's this big debate about, well, why can you heal someone? Why can you say your sins are forgiven? And in verse 6, Jesus says to this audience that you might know that the Son of Man has got power on earth to forgive sins. Then saith he to the sick of the palsy, Arise, take up your bed and go unto your house. So in that moment, again, Jesus comes to remove all the consequences of sin from the earth, and he is able to do that. And in Matthew chapter 11, there's a quote that says, "Come unto me, all ye that are weary, and I will give you rest." So Jesus says explicitly to them, I know what you're carrying, and I want you to bring it to me. It's this same move every time someone arrives carrying something, and Jesus lifts it. He deburdens them in different ways. When you read the Gospels around Christ, you have to expect the inversion, which is sometimes if you come at a topic the way, well, this is what I would do at a particular situation, you miss the power of Christ about how he thinks through things. It can run different to our own instinct for fairness. We might go, well, this is how we would level the score. It's not the way Jesus works. And we can expect to be surprised. And I'll just go a little deeper on that quote there in Matthew 11 and verse 28. Come to me, all ye that are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. He told everyone that his load was easy because he carries no debt. He didn't do any sin, which means he didn't fall short of God's expectations. He didn't owe anything there. And it also means then, in terms of his history, or what we might like to think about as baggage in our own lives, he's got no old wounds that he is dragging around with him that is shaping who he is on that particular day, like we might be. Or he's not looking at different people and saying, I've got some score to settle with you. He has no guilt. There's no score to settle. Just holding on to that phrase, no score to settle, is just like what we do, or we can do. I maybe should only speak for myself and not for you, about when somebody wrongs you, you think, we will square up on this at some point in time in the future. You took something from me. You haven't made this right. You owe me. And so that sense of unforgiveness becomes a debt. And it might only be something that you recognise is there. The person who caused the injury, let's say, they might not know that they've done it. They've moved on, but every day you're thinking about it. They still owe me. Jesus carries none of that. And he's trying to take this group of disciples and talk to them about a different way of living. And they're just a group of disciples like us, wrestling with the same types of challenges. And when we come into Matthew chapter 18, there's a story there where these disciples are starting to have a little bit of a fight amongst themselves. They have this question in Matthew chapter 18 about who's going to be the greatest in this kingdom of heaven. In terms of geography, they had been living in the north part of Israel in a place called Galilee, and they were making their way down to the capital, Jerusalem. There's a lot of hype about that Jesus was about to become the king over Israel at this time, and they're all jockeying for positions. And in verse 1 it says, at the same time came the disciples to Jesus saying, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Sort this argument out for us. And if we want to step into what would be the backstory that's going on there, if they're escalating, there's a lot of debate. Just think about situations in your own life. If it's in the school class, things get out of hand, you're going to escalate to the teacher. Things get out of hand at home, you want to go and talk to mum and dad, right? You just want to bring in reinforcements. Somebody who's going to be the level head, the court of appeal, as it were, and they come to Jesus. So this chapter, which has got a lot in it about forgiveness, doesn't open with Jesus saying, Now, I want you to sit down and I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about forgiveness. It opens with a wound. The disciples have just hurt each other. I'm going to read through verses 1 to 5 and just see what Jesus' next action is when that wound has been presented amongst this group of disciples. So the debate, as we've read, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus calls a little child unto him and sets him in the midst of them and said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoso shall receive one such little child in my name, receiveth me. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone was hanged around his neck and he was drowned in the depths of the sea. What's going on in these verses? The disciples are arguing about who's the most important, an argument that hurts people, an argument that creates winners and losers, scores to settle up. And it's inside this group of the disciples. It's not out to the wider community. And Jesus doesn't settle the argument. He completely flips and changes the direction. How did we get here? We got here through pride. We got here through rivalry. We got here through the very human need to know where you stand. The child in the middle of the room becomes the central image of everything that is Jesus going to outline. Why a child? Why bring a child into this situation? And again, even just focusing on the child for a moment, this is a discussion or a chapter that is about adult to adult relationships. It's not about hurt between a child and an adult. But he here is using the child as an example for something. He's not placing the child in the middle of the argument, but he's placing the child in the middle of the hurt. What has a child got in this situation? The child's got innocence. The child has got no skin in the game, as it were. The child carries no score. The child carries no old wound that has defined their identity. They've got no history of the last 3 years as this group of disciples has been pulled together on the road following Jesus. The child is the image of the unburdened self. It's the innocence. It's the question that we could ask ourselves, which is, who were we before the hurt became part of how we describe ourselves? In verse 3, Jesus does have a message. It says, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children. I'm reading here from the King James, as I will consistently through the night. But be converted. What does that word mean? Well, our New Testament comes through the Greek language, and so we can inspect or do inquiry of the Greek language to understand a little bit more about it. And that converted word means to turn around, not just like a self-help book or do some improvement, do better next time. This is completely changing direction, thinking about this situation in a new way. So it's not a resolution of an argument at all. It's an invitation to become a different sort of person, to become an innocent person who is deburdened with the arguments and the debates and the hurt of this age. And that's why we have to just sit and meditate with some of the messages that happen in this particular chapter. It needs a lot of time and thinking And that's why, again, I stress no expectation on you resolving anything tonight in your own mind. There's a lot of words that get thrown around, like, are we in a situation of, like, what should happen here? And we're all ones that, like things to get back together or things to get smoothed over. And what's the right process? Forgiveness, reconciliation, restoration, what do they all mean? People like to avoid conflict, want to keep the peace. So just 3 words that mean 3 very distinct things. It's important to think through this distinction about these different words, because a lot of harm can actually be done by collapsing any of these 3 things into one or some sort of mixture of them. So the word for forgiveness is an inner act, and it's yours alone. It only requires you, doesn't require anyone else. Nobody else needs to be in the room. Can be yourself, or in a faith context, can be yourself with God. Reconciliation is getting the relationship back. That requires both people, and it can't be forced, because both, to achieve a reconciliation, have to agree. And restoration is the full repair to the community. It's the deepest goal, and it takes time. And why do I say forgiveness is an inner act and it only requires you? Well, there's a definition inside the chapter, so it's in context in verse 35. Without doing the preamble, and we'll come back to this verse towards the end. It says there, "So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses." What's the location of forgiveness in that verse? How many people are involved in that verse? If you, from your hearts, forgive not everyone his brother. It's just you, it's just your heart. So forgiveness is an inner act. It only requires you. No one else needs to be in the room. And it's something that we are called to do. I touched on the Lord's Prayer earlier tonight, the teaching prayer. Forgive our debts as we expect God to forgive us, and he will forgive us. And it can be challenging because in terms of, why this is important is when we think about reconciliation, it's going to meet someone else. Because there can be some tough things in lots of people's lives. And you might say the person that I have got a great burden with or a great debt with, they're not alive anymore. Or they're not cognitively sound that I can have a discussion with them. Or they're not emotionally intelligent that they're going to respond the right way. In fact, if I do engage with them, it will cause me harm. And so that statement at the bottom of the slide, which is you can't reconcile with someone who hasn't done the work of being accountable, but you can focus on forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't need the other person to be there to say sorry or even to know that they've been forgiven. What's the power in the statement that comes through that verse 35? It's a choice about who gets to write your story from this point forward. Our title tonight is about Jesus talking about bringing us peace. Why do I have those words about who gets to write your story from that point forward? Well, before I talked about the debt that you might have experienced. That person owes me. And it becomes your burden, and it's what you drag around all around the place. and it defines your story. And Jesus is saying, I want you to be a citizen of my kingdom and not be dragged into thinking about all the hurt that takes place in this current age of man ruling over this earth. So where does Jesus go from here? Well, he extends their thinking, and he does one of his classic teaching moves, which is he goes into talk about a parable. And it's a parable of the lost sheep. It's from verse 12 to 14 of this chapter. I'm going to read verse 12 to 14 now. Actually, 11 to 14. For the Son of Man, or a title of Jesus, so Jesus came to save that was lost. How think ye, if a man have 100 sheep, and one of them be gone astray, doth he not leave the 99 and goeth into the mountains and seeketh that which is gone astray? And if so be that he find it, verily I say unto you, he rejoiceth more of that sheep than of the 99 which went not astray. Even so it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. This is a classic Christ move to stop the focus being inward and to think outward. If I wanted to look at this as an accountant, which I feel like I'm qualified to do, you might go, it's a 1% loss. That's perfectly acceptable. We can move on. Maybe, in the flock there'll be some growth and some return next year. Things will go our way. But here, the shepherd is prepared to put the whole flock at risk to go find that one, looking outward. Is this a story about forgiveness, or is it a story about reconciliation? I'm going to put it to you that it's a story about reconciliation, because the shepherd wouldn't go out and find that sheep if they didn't want them to be part of the flock. So again, lifting above the parable and thinking about the meaning, you would say that forgiveness has already happened here. Let's keep remembering that the disciples are sitting there percolating away the dispute that they've had. There's 12 of them staring each other down, who said what, all those sorts of things, how they're going to move forward together as a group. The shepherd goes, he doesn't wait. This is how God moves. And this is how Jesus expects his community to move. And I'm going to use the word community deliberately, and I'll explain why when we get a little bit later in the chapter as well. Because this is a community that is hearing his message, and it's called the gospel, the good news. So it's something different to the news that everybody has been tuned into from the religious leaders of that day. It's something different because in Matthew chapter 5, he talks about these believers will shine as lights. They'll be like a city on a hill. They will glow and they'll be seen as different, not the instinctive response where hurt comes that you will expect people to go, there's payback coming. There's a score that has to be settled later on. So he's primed them to think differently. So now he sets in front of them what is referred to classically as a 3-step conflict resolution process. I'm going to read these verses 15 to 20 through you, and you're going to see 3 different stages that Jesus then says as examples about what can happen, about how to get a lost sheep back. It says there in verse 15, "Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee 2 take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. For verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And again I say unto you, that if 2 of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about those verses, but it's immediately going to pivot to a question Peter is going to ask about this topic. It feels like commandments, and it feels like a process. I put it to you that these are wisdom principles. And a question you might have is, why bother going out to this person at all? And this is this inversion that Christ does. Because you can say, why would I go out and see this particular person? It can feel like there's risk involved. So why go at all? Because you actually realise the forgiveness that you yourself have experienced. So in the first example, going out and talking to the person one-to-one. This is not a discussion about levelling up scores. This is about winning that particular person, recovering that person. And there's a range of scenarios that might happen here. The person might have a total blind spot to what they have done. The person might be very defensive. It does meet a great technique, which is conflict is always best resolved at the lowest level before things escalate. But it's not a scorekeeping exercise. Remember, forgiveness has already happened. This is about reconciliation. I want us as a community, remember this is designated for these 12 disciples about how they're going to work things through themselves as a teaching pattern, how they can resolve that situation and move forward. Then it says, to bring someone you trust. In the King James Version, we've got the idea of bringing 1 or 2 witnesses. And if we read this chapter and just come at that from a sense of law, we go, I'm going to prosecute a case. But if you nest it in the chapter and say, where are we going with this? You're not there to prosecute a case, you're trying to win someone back because you've already given forgiveness. So think about walking in those shoes if you're already forgiven the person and you are going to that particular situation. It might be in the first outing, a discussion that you got dismissed out of hand, might have thrown some doubts in your own mind going, okay, maybe I was wrong, maybe I misheard that, voices in your head and all those sorts of things. But then the next time you go with other people going, no, this is a real thing, and we're really interested in this particular person because if it goes left unchecked, it's going to cause more damage. And the last one there, it says in verse, let me find my place. We'll go for the Specsavers moment now. 17, thank you. I was just getting there, but thanks, Brad. You've got my back. Thank you. We're taking it to the church, it says there. On the slide, I've used the word community. It's the Greek word ecclesia. The word church or ecclesia only happens 3 times in the book of Matthew. 2 are in this verse. The only other one is Jesus talking to Peter in chapter 16 and verse 18, where he's talking about the future role that he wants for Peter. And after a conversation with Peter, he says, Peter, upon this rock, as in yourself, I'm going to build my church or my community, and things are not going to prevail against it. This is protect the community stuff. And why I'm trying to avoid using the idea of the church is because if we wanted something contextual at that time, it would have said the word synagogue. That was the religious institution of that time in that location. So this is a community of believers that is distinct from the synagogue. In fact, the synagogue was known for people that if they didn't toe a particular line, they would get ostracised from the synagogue. But it does say there that if you can't reconcile with the person, that you need to let them go. They can be unto you as a heathen man and a publican. So like a Gentile, a non-Jew, and a taxpayer, to try and modernise the language a little bit. Let's be clear, Jesus did go and speak to taxpayers and Gentiles. So there was still preaching, but not considered part of the community because they hadn't decided to humble themselves and choose another path. So it's like if I can't reconcile with this person, I actually just need to let them go because they actually need to reset on a whole lot of things, because we're not just missing each other by a little bit, we're missing each other by a lot. And there's a number of us that have come to this particular opinion. And the reason for having a number of people involved is to try and avoid the sense of bias, which is something that we all suffer with. So why go out and talk to that person at all? Well, if you don't want to go out and talk in the first instance, it might be the first skewering question, which is you're still keeping score. I'm going to get myself into the kingdom. I'm going to be okay. Feels a lot like the discussion and the dispute in verse 1, where the disciples were working amongst themselves about who was going to be the greatest. If I let that person go with their unresolved problems unchecked, unchallenged, to use like an everyday expression, I'm all right, thanks, Jack, right? Me, I'm okay. And I will just keep re-emphasising that it might not be for everyone. It might not be safe for everybody to be involved in this process, and that's why I would think about it as wisdom principles. And that's so it's real to recognise personal safety in that, and that's okay. Because another criticism that can happen of this, which is, well, Christ didn't do this as a three-step process. You might find that Christ walks into the temple one day and turns over the tables of the money changers. You can go, well, hang on, where was the one-to-one simple chat with somebody first? Then where was, no, we need to move to stage 2, and then we move to stage 3. This is a chapter about disciples trying to hold each other accountable about what it means to live a life in Christ and find their way. And that's just difficult enough as it is. But we have this idea that clicks around in our head about keeping score. we can be honest and know that it's there, because when Jesus does the Lord's Prayer, he says, forgive our debts, as we ask God to forgive our debts. So I'm going to forgive somebody else because I expect God to forgive me. So we want to click into our natural bias of finding a law and finding a pattern. It feels safe because it's uncertain about what this looks like without law. Peter was absolutely on that train. In verse 21, Peter's mulling this over, and then came Peter to him and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Till 7 times? Okay, thanks for that. Must be a limit. Like, where do I go? Where's the upper point? And Jesus said unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. And there's a little call out on that 70 times 7 to the only other time that expression is mentioned is in Genesis chapter 4, where it's about how long revenge is going to be in place, where somebody says, I'm going to get this person till 70 times 7. So it's like Jesus is dragging that idea of a revenge and a law place to say completely the opposite, right at the other end of a continuum. Imagine keeping score for that long, for whatever the maths is around that. What a burden. When Jesus has said, come unto me, all ye that are weary, and I will release that burden from you. So Peter thinks he's being generous by saying, well, 7 times feels like an acceptable amount. 7 was above what was expected. It's more than this 3-step process. And Jesus doesn't sort of start to get dragged into an administrative process for this. Jesus doesn't give a bigger number. He just wants to get rid of the whole idea of counting. Because the moment you're counting, you're keeping score. Keeping score is the burden. Forgiveness is the putting down. It's making peace. It's the letting go. So Jesus extends this conflict about the law into a teaching parable again, about this parable of these 2 individuals. It goes from verse 23 to verse 34. So there is one servant who owed his master 10,000 talents. So 1 talent was the equivalent of 6,000 days' wages, and here's 10,000 of them. So it's like all the income of a regional economy, just a ridiculous amount of money, and the king in that story, in that parable, counsels all of it. Just an incredible amount there, just an impossible number. So the point is that there's a debt here that could never be paid, and the king counsels it entirely. So how did the person respond when they had that debt forgiven? Well, in verse 28, we find the response of a servant who he himself was owed some money. So he's just been completely forgiven of this massive debt. And in verse 28, he says, that same servant went out and found one of his fellow servants, which owed him 100 pence, and he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, pay me that thou owest. So it's not that he just went and said, notice of demand, I need my money. He grabbed him by the throat. Things got physical. There's anger involved in here. This is score-settling stuff, not just as a ledger or as a bank balance or anything like that. That means he wanted his pound of flesh, as it were. It's like, you caused me some pain, I didn't like that experience that I just had, even though I had my debt forgiven. I'm going to pound you as part of this process of asking for some money back. And so what did the king do when he found out about this particular situation? He found out about this story, about this demand, and he put him in prison. So the person who had shown that he wasn't part of the community, wasn't working in a new way, and was very legalistic in terms of their approach, had to leave, and he's been put into prison. Again, there's a lot in these particular parables, and for time we're just really stepping through this chapter, and that's why I emphasise there is a lot here, and we really need to sit with the impact of all the words here in this chapter. So something that can be said in terms of people's perspective about what forgiveness is in the Bible is this idea that you just need to forgive and everybody can move on. Just want to recognise that that statement in itself can cause wounds. Why does it cause wounds? Because it skips over the accountability and it skips over who God is. It can let harm keep going. And it doesn't allow the recognition that pain can still be there even though forgiveness has happened. In that verse 35 at the end of that chapter, it says there, "Forgive in your hearts and forgive your brother their trespasses." So we need some definitions then of what forgiveness does look like and doesn't look like. And there's actually some that we can draw from this particular chapter about what it does look like. So there's a big list on this slide, and that's because I'm trying to add clarity, I hope. What forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not pretending that the hurt didn't happen, because relationships invariably are changed after a sin or a trespass or a major event, especially significant ones. It's not asking people in forgiveness to empty themselves and become emotionless about this and immediately moving to trusting again. Why is it not automatically trusting again? Because that's reconciliation. That's not forgiveness. Doesn't mean that you have to say then it was okay, it was nothing. Because this discussion is, what does it mean to be part or to be a follower of Christ? So it is good to actually say what is the right principle in any situation. It doesn't mean going back to an unsafe situation, and it's not the same as getting back together. Remember, from verse 35, it can just be one person by themselves. It might be, but that's more likely to be reconciliation, isn't it? So forgiveness can be a slow choice that you make by yourself, or you might be able to make it fast. And it might be something that you do on more than one occasion on the same thing. As verse 35 says, it can be between you and God, and no one else is needed. And releasing that debt, because this is about you, and recapturing that childlike spirit and that innocence, rewriting your story and not letting it define you. Acknowledging that the hurt will still be there, but trying to live without that burden and leave it with God. Forgiveness certainly is real, and it can happen without contact or reconciliation. Again, it's just a different variation of looking at that verse 35. And it doesn't need to come from a response to something that you have been told in a conversation or another form of communication. It's something that you can work through by yourself. Now, sometime in this particular chapter, it's been couched as the disciples amongst themselves and about the community and what they represent. There is other scenarios out there, and I offer quite a famous one about the thief on the cross. So Jesus is crucified, and he's alongside two others called thieves, which means that they have done something wrong. And one says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says to him on that day, "You're going to be with me in paradise." There's no stepped through process here, like Matthew 18, verse 15 to 20. No process, no fixing things first. That was enough. That was forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. Clearly that person had done something really wrong if the court found the outcome correctly and he wasn't crucified as an innocent person. So just kind of to be playful for that, it's not demanding, you can only be in the kingdom if you're get down off the cross, go and talk to these people, get on the same page, then come back here, finish the crucifixion. Of course, that's nonsense, isn't it? So here's a situation of the individual coming to their own conclusion that they are a sinner. They have caused hurt. They've got some history that they need to make their own peace with. And that's why, as well, it's important not to just rest everything about Matthew 18. It's a story written for the disciples, particularly around the community, how the community is going to represent itself. Is the community going to be seen as shining as lights and a name bearer of Christ? And absolutely providing some practical examples about what to do. But the thief on the cross story just provides just a very simple and another perspective on this as well. So two slides for some thoughts to conclude tonight. There's a lot of different things that might go on in your mind as you're thinking through some of the messages here from Matthew chapter 18. Because conflict always has a lot of emotion sitting around it. And that's why it's important just to sit with it, and we will know that when we're emotive, we might not be the most effective with some decisions. So the first recommendation that I would make is to think about what's I've covered tonight, and again continue to look at Matthew chapter 18 and just let it sink in. Sit with you before you think about what you want to do next. Another important point is to be honest about what you are carrying, what is your burden, what is stopping you being the innocent child. What has to happen in order for you to have that release and take that next step? And what might that next step be? What will that look like for you? It's not saying you have to work through the whole process. It can just be the next step. So I think it's very powerful in that story about Jesus putting that child in the centre of that discussion, reminding us where we've all come from. That we don't need to carry a wound, we don't need to be the debt, We don't need to be defined by what was done to us. But we can be the child that Jesus called into the middle of that room before the wound, especially before it became load-bearing for us. It's something that we need to take our time with and then make our peace. As verse 35 ends, it needs to come from our heart. We need to allow the time for us to work that through in our heart and find our life at peace and also the hope that our God has given to us. Thanks.